Bezos. He is from the city of South Bend, and he's a sustainability coordinator. So he's a young man on the brink of a great career. So we can help him along a little bit here, maybe. So Alan, go ahead.
So, good morning, everyone. I'm running Zoom today, too, so we're jumping back and forth. So I just wanted to give a very quick overview of the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment. And my co-authors I want to acknowledge. So Mike Baldwin at Purdue and I were the leads on the climate working group. Also, Kyuhyun Byun, who was a PhD student at the time in my lab. Scott Robeson at Indiana University helped a lot with data processing. And Melissa Whitholm was the outreach coordinator for the Purdue Climate Change Research Center, which was the sort of the main organization at Purdue that produced this assessment. Next slide, please. Go. So just so you have some links if you want to follow up, there are a lot of great reports that are written for lay people on the assessment. And there's access to data. These are some papers that we're supporting the effort. So again, just in case you want to dig into those resources. Next slide, please. All right, so I think most of us are aware that climate change is one of the major sustainability challenges that we face in coming decades. We are very reliant in assessing what climate change will mean for our region. We're very dependent on climate models. And so these are sophisticated computer programs that simulate from first principles the behavior of the world's climate system. And in particular, what they have been used for in climate change assessments. If we see greenhouse gases increasing, then these models simulate what will happen to the atmosphere, oceans, and other portions of the global climate system in response to that. So what I'm going to show you today are the results of these kinds of experiments with these global climate models for two emission concentration scenarios. The first one is called RCP 8.5, and it represents kind of a worst case scenario in the assessment. So this assumes that we kind of keep doing what we're doing, or even worse going forward, that we couple our economies to greenhouse gas production and burning of fossil fuels, and we keep doing that. So again, this results in major changes by the end of the 21st century, as we'll see in a moment. So RCP 4.5 is kind of what is often called a middle-of-the-road scenario. Assumes we take very significant global action to reduce greenhouse gas concentrations and thus reduce the impacts. All right, so these scenarios of emissions are fed to the global climate models. And the climate models then predict what will happen to variables like temperature, precipitation, and so forth. And also what happens to global circulation will respond. So for example, we can have different storm tracks or different arrival times between storms, all these different kinds of things the climate models simulate. Next slide, please. All right, so this is an overview just showing sort of the big picture, and all of these results are for the state of Indiana. We also have results for the Midwest as a whole, the globe as a whole, et cetera, but this is Indiana alone. Okay, so the sort of salmon-colored range there, that's the range from 10 different climate models going forward from essentially now to the end of the 21st century. And the salmon-colored ones are for RCP 8.5, the worst-case scenario. We see about 10.5 degrees Fahrenheit warming on average. That's sort of the middle range of all of those 10 models. So this is a very large change in temperature for average. So if we see this happen, for example, we expect to see extinction of 40% of the world's species. It's those kinds of crazy numbers. This is very, very, very bad. If we get it together and can respond globally to this crisis, perhaps we can come down to something like RCP 4.5, which is about half the warming by the end of the 21st century. So it's very important that people respond to this challenge and reduce these impacts. Next slide, please. So this is a somewhat complicated slide showing the effects to temperature and precipitation. Look at all the way to the right, look at the 2080s there. And so on the top we have temperature. You can see that temperature is fairly evenly distributed between all the different months, but we see definitely a strong warming in the summertime. And for precipitation, it's a more complicated pattern, but basically we see increasing precipitation in the winter and spring. Pretty much all the models say that that will happen. We have less certainty about the summer. There we see some models say that it will be drier overall, some say wetter. Towards the end of the summer, we see more significant drying. All right, so very strong temperature increases throughout the year. We see wetter in winter and spring, somewhat drier in summer. And we also see from other tools that we have increasing storm intensity. So for example, small-scale thunderstorms are projected pretty much to increase across the board in summertime, even though the summers may be drier. Next slide, please. So one of the tools that we do to communicate, so what does this mean for us on the ground? It's often difficult to take numbers like the ones I've just shown you and make sense of them. So one of the tools that we use are sort of called geographical analogs, meaning we try to find a place on the globe that has the future climate of Indiana. Does that make sense? So we're going to find a place in the United States where we have something that looks like the future projections. So for winter, what we see is Indiana will look a lot like the mid-Atlantic states, say Maryland. So Maryland frequently has temperatures below freezing in the middle of the winter, but not very much snow. And so that's kind of what we project will happen for Indiana, is that we will see wetter conditions and also warmer with less snow. But we will still have winter in the middle of the winter. So for example, December and January will still often be below freezing. Okay, next slide. So this is the summertime. So again, remember that the climate models project very strong warming at that time and also somewhat drier conditions. And we see that means for the 2080s, we might see something like Houston is what South Bend will be like, and Indiana as a whole. So this is not very hot and humid weather is what's projected by the climate models. Okay, next slide, please. All right, there are many ways in which these kinds of changes will impact our lives. And I'm, in the interest of time and giving Alex the time that he needs, I'm going to just really talk about two: extreme heat and humidity, and then flooding and stormwater impacts. But there are many others. And I think, outdoor recreation is another one that really affects many of us here, I think. Next slide, please. All right, so we have extreme heat. So these are what we've done here is just take some counties in different parts of the state. So in northern Indiana, it's pretty much right around South Bend. And then near Indianapolis and Marion County, and then down south in southern Indiana, we have one county down there as well. So there's actually a pretty significant difference between the climate in southern Indiana and northern Indiana. All right, so for example, in southern Indiana, if we track the number of days per year that are above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, there are on average, about 10 every year. For the 2080s, RCP 8.5, so the worst case in the 2080s, we expect to see 100 days per year above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So huge, huge change. Now a little bit better here in South Bend, we have typically three days per year on average above 95. That's projected to increase to about 60 days per year. And similar for Chicago. So as you can imagine, in urban settings where we have vulnerable populations, these kinds of extreme heat scenarios require a lot of planning and adaptation to ensure that those who are most vulnerable can find heat refugia or other things. Our basement would be a really great heat refugia, actually, in South Bend. So that's something maybe to think about. Okay, so extreme heat, very important. And so, go ahead, go ahead. So certainly human health, in cities particularly, heat, humidity, air quality, all expected to degrade. Outdoor work and recreation, it may actually become very difficult to work outside in the daytime. So we may see people moving to doing construction projects in the night. That's some of the kinds of things. Agricultural impacts. Corn does not like high temperature. We may see major shifts in agriculture to crops that do better in very warm conditions. Or possibly the land would be fallow even if we can't find a good crop for that temperature. Terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, we expect to see major increases in water temperature in the Great Lakes and in rivers that feed the Great Lakes, and this has important implications for ecosystems, forests, fish, and wildlife. And energy supply and demand also is a very important factor, particularly in the summertime when we see these dramatic increases in temperature. Next slide, please. All right, so the last one I want to talk about, and I'm going to go pretty quickly here, is rain versus snow. These are numbers, again, for those same three counties in north, middle, and southern Indiana. And this is the percentage of precipitation from November to March, so this sort of typical snow season, that falls as falling as snow. So I can't read the numbers, 36% I think for St. Joseph County. And you can see as we go forward in time, those numbers decline. So as we have more and more warming in the wintertime, we see less and less snow essentially. Instead, we have rain. Now keep in mind that the amount of precipitation is also going up. So it's not only that we have more rain, but we also have more precipitation as a whole. So that means a lot more rain. So we have seen kind of some dry runs of this in recent years. I'll show you some pictures. Next slide, please. So particularly, related to winter flooding and stormwater impacts. Next slide, please. All right, so here's, this is an example of extreme precipitation that occurred in August of 2016. This is a picture of my son and one of the neighbor kids canoeing on our park. So we had about 8 inches of rain, and that was, roughly speaking, about a 500-year event, according to the historical statistics. So these kinds of events are becoming more and more frequent across the Midwest, and we see them occurring in different cities at different times. But these, in many cities, have become something like the 10-year event. In Toronto, for example, we had 2 storms about 10 years apart on this caliber. All right, so urban stormwater, big issue. Next slide, please. All right, so the other is river flooding. And so we had an extreme flood in February of 2018. Started out like this, about 18 inches of snow on the ground. It all melted in a few days. Then we had 5 inches of rain, which in February is an absolutely gigantic number. We never have precipitation like that. So just to give you a sense of it, I mean, if you had 5 inches of rain in February under normal conditions, that would be more than 50 inches of snow. We have never had that. So it's a huge amount of water at a time of year when we don't get that. All right, so the snow primed the pump. We had then this huge event. And next slide, please. Okay, so we had this extreme river flood and so by the numbers, this was a 2,400-year flood. That's kind of an amazing number. That's what you get if you just run the numbers. And again, we had a lot of groundwater flooding and those kinds of issues. Next slide, so just to show you that hydrologists are not immune to these kinds of impacts. Here's Nokomis Park. Once again, you'll notice now this is river water. Before, the other picture, it was clear, right? Now we see this muddy river water coming into the park. Okay, next slide. Here's my basement. So the water was about knee-deep in my basement. Those people who didn't have a backflow preventer on their storm drains, they got sewage coming into their basement, so I avoided that. But with the storm drain closed to stop the backflow from the sewage system, then we had all the groundwater flooding, and it basically just filled it up like a bathtub. So I had to buy a 4,000 gallon per hour pump, and it took 2 hours to pump that out. So it was, our neighborhood got really badly hit. Okay, next slide, I think this is just summary. So the future projections suggest a 45% increase in the 100-year flood for the St. Joseph. But I think we have already seen impacts that exceed this, which raises a lot of questions. Next slide. All right, so just a few conclusions. I've covered these, so you have them at the end. And so hopefully Alex can give us a sense of how this fits into the sustainability landscape. And we'll have a question and answer session after the service, just in the interest of time. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name's Alex Bazán. I'm the Sustainability Project Manager for the City of South Bend's Office of Sustainability. Started in January, so still pretty new to the job, so about 6 months in. So I'm going to talk about two topics. One of them is going to be a grassroots campaign in NWI, Northwest Indiana. And then I'm also going to talk about some of our efforts through the Office of Sustainability when it comes to climate change. Next slide, please. And in addition to those two topics, I'm going to tie in two themes. So one of them is, we've heard a lot about the climate movement. So like, where is the climate movement happening, right? Where do we see that here locally in the Midwest? Is it happening, and who's a part of it? Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about this grassroots campaign. So in February 2020, in Highland, Indiana, they organized this event. It was called the Climate Action Blitz, it was an event just before they officially announced the pandemic. And so I just happened to be back in the area. I actually was living in Highland. I was previously living out of state, and I was looking for new opportunities. And I just happened to go back to the region where I grew up. This event was, how can we take action locally on climate change? And when I refer to NWI, Northwest Indiana, I'm referring to Lake County, Porter County, and LaPorte County. And so how this event was structured is that they organized the tables according to zip codes. So folks sat at tables according to their zip code, met their neighbors, and then they heard from speakers about what they could do locally to take action on climate. Next slide, please. And one of the speakers was a representative from Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute. And so they talked about this program that they offer to governmental entities within the state of Indiana, so cities, towns, municipalities, counties. And it was called the Resilience Cohort. And so they had, there's 3 different stages to that cohort. Those offerings are in alternate years. The first stage would be to develop a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And so they would do that as part of this program. They would provide technical assistance, potentially an intern to assist in completing that greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And then in following years, you would be informed by that inventory to create a climate action plan. And then in the year after that, you could also participate in starting to implement some of those strategies, those actions that are part of that climate action plan. And so for the focus of that climate action blitz, the representative was speaking about how there's an opportunity for local government entities to participate in the first stage of this, which is the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Next slide, please. What is a greenhouse gas emissions inventory? So it's basically an accounting of our emissions, and Alan talked about this a little bit, greenhouse gas emissions. And so these are the emissions that contribute to climate change, that warm our atmosphere and are the cause of our climate crisis. And so there's different things that are the contributors of those emissions. So some of those are electricity, transportation, our waste, the treatment of our water. And so when you think about this, like the burning of our coal or natural gas, the burning of our gasoline, diesel, those are emissions that are contributing to climate change. And so really the basis of these inventories is, you can't manage what you can't measure, and if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And so having these inventories is sort of the basis, the foundation for making plans that are data-driven, that are strategic in terms of being able to reduce your emissions. Next slide, please. Leaving the Climate Action Blitz, one of the goals for each of these tables that represent different zip codes that represent the region is leaving that event with making a commitment through that table, through that group that was your town, and my town being the town of Highland, to take action on climate. So to continue having conversations with your neighbors to take action on climate change. And so we formed the group Highland Neighbors for Sustainability. Next slide, please. And so we thought, hey, let's start with the resilience cohort. We think this is a great idea. We think this is a great way to start a conversation with our local municipality, the town of Highland. There's actually not many towns and cities in the region in Northwest Indiana that have done a greenhouse gas emissions inventory at this point in time. There was the city, Michigan City, the city of Gary. Those were sort of the two sort of leaders in getting to that point where they actually had an inventory. Next slide, please. And so we started to continue having meetings post the Climate Action Blitz. So we started to continue to meet, do research, reach out to IU and have a better understanding of the program. Next slide, please. And so then the pandemic hit, and so we had, we stopped meeting in person. So now we're trying to figure out Zoom. We're doing conference calls. We're still trying to keep that momentum and that passion of what we can do to take action on climate. And with our friends and families that live throughout the region, the neighboring towns and cities that are part of Northwest Indiana, they stopped meeting. They stopped meeting post the Climate Action Blitz, and we were the only group that was continuously meeting and trying to find ways where we could continue to work on potentially having participation through the resilience cohort. Next slide, please. And so, as we heard from our neighbors and our families and friends that live throughout the region, that they stopped meeting and we were the only ones meeting, we also thought, well, why not think about this through a regional lens? We think of ourselves as a region. We're a pretty densely populated part of the state. We breathe the same air. We drink the same water. We're pretty interconnected. And so, next slide, please. And so, as part of the resilience cohort, the way the program was initially structured, and it was still fairly a new program, was that individual governmental entities had to apply to be part of this program. And next slide, please. And so as we continue to have conversations with IU, we said, well, would you consider a regional applicant, as part of this application, to have regional applicants be part of that application? And after some conversations, they said, yes, we can make that happen. And next slide, please. And so we formed the group NWI Region Resilience. And so this group was a way to re-energize and mobilize and bring back the folks that were part of that original Climate Action Blitz and other folks that weren't able to participate but may be interested to be part of this effort to be part of a regional application to do a regional greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Next slide, please. And so as part of that, we're like, okay, well, we need a regional partner. Who would be a great regional partner to be applying on behalf of communities to be part of this regional application, right? And so similar to what we have here in South Bend, we have MACOG, the Michiana Council of Governments. We have in Northwest Indiana, NERPC, the Northwest Indiana Regional Planning Commission. They represent what we tend to think of as the region, which is Lake County, Porter County, and LaPorte County. They have relationships with the individual governmental entities that exist within Northwest Indiana. They do economic development, they do transportation, they work on environmental issues. Next slide, please. So we reached out to NERPC and we said, hey, would you be willing to be applying on behalf of Northwest Indiana communities through this program, the Resilience Cohort? And they said, well, we really need to hear from local elected officials to support this. So next slide, please. And so we got back to organizing and we said, okay, well, we need to really convince, all these different government entities that represent Northwest Indiana so that we could show proof that, hey, there's support for this application. So, a lot of virtual meetings. We ended up, developing email campaigns, phone campaigns. We're leveraging different folks' networks. And then at times we would also meet in person through social distancing and wearing masks. And that translated into fact sheets and then eventually pitches where we would present to local elected officials, whether that's one-on-one in the park with masks on, with social distancing, or whether that was virtually where we would present at study sessions that council members tend to have, or during formal council meetings. Next slide, please. And so this is sort of like our first version of the fact sheet, and basically what it's describing is what's this resilience cohort, what is a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, why is it important, what's the cost, and by the way, like the cost is cost effective. It's no more than $3,000. That's assuming that there's a recommended contribution that municipalities could provide. And typically, if you were to do this privately, an inventory could cost as much as 10, 12, 15 grand. So, really cost effective, highly subsidized program. Next slide, please. And so these are some of the other talking points that in addition to that. So, yes, we have, with this inventory, you can make data-driven decisions. There's other benefits as well. So if you reduce your emissions, you can improve air quality. We have emissions testing in Northwest Indiana, so that's a major concern. We also, reducing emissions leads to mitigating the effects of climate change. There's also opportunities through this, through reducing emissions, to create a more resilient region, a more equitable region. There's also a component of this program which is where you have an intern that conducts the inventory. So there's really that opportunity to support local college students, mitigate the effects of what's often described as brain drain, where we cultivate all this, we channel in all this time and energy, and we cultivate all this talent and skills in our students from all these great universities, and then oftentimes they leave the region or leave the state as a whole. So here we have an opportunity to have students that grew up in the region or just in the state that could contribute their skills and their talents to this inventory. And then of course there's that economic competitive advantage with all this, where you have the data and you can think more systematically about how you plan as a city, as a town, as a county, as a region. Next slide, please. And so these are some other forms of ways that we try to convince local elected officials about that there's support for this. So we had an online petition, and this is really showing, hey, like there's folks within our town, within our city, within our county that want to see this greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Next slide, please. And this is another thing we did. We created a website, so we know that not everyone's on Facebook, not everyone's on Twitter. We really wanted to reach a broad audience. And so we also had a website that talked about, this campaign effort and how they can get involved. Next slide, please. We also had a fundraising campaign, and so this is sort of a way to say, hey, we want to vote with our dollar. And so we had another key partner as part of this was Earth Charter Indiana. They typically focus on youth. They're based in Indianapolis, but they have regional coordinators throughout the state, and so they have one in Northwest Indiana. And so really the focus when we started this fundraising campaign is how can we make this even more affordable for local governmental entities? How can we have also an equity lens on this for the communities that have less of a means to participate, especially the frontline communities, the communities that have the most industry, that tend to receive the most of the pollution throughout Northwest Indiana. Next slide, please. And so ultimately we convinced Lake County to pass a resolution that we drafted and that we worked with them to pass. And then we went back to NERC and they passed their resolution. And next slide, please. And so now that NERC is hearing from is seeing that Lake County is interested, and Lake County, by the way, is the most populated county in Northwest Indiana, in the region. We went back to governmental entities and we started to convince them. Next slide, please. And so there's a host of challenges, and I won't get into all of them, but next slide. Of course, there was the pandemic. There was, it's a very technical campaign, so there's a lot of education that goes along with that. It was also election season. There's also different political parties involved. So those are all sort of the different things we had to navigate as part of this. We continue to fine-tune our messaging. Next slide, please. And then this is a newer version of the fact sheet. So as we continue to have conversations with IU, we had a better sense of what the cost of a regional application would be. We also had a better sense of the timeline. And so, these are things we could better communicate with, the different governments that we were trying to convince. Next slide, please. And so we passed a resolution through Munster, and basically once we passed the resolution through the town of Munster, it was sort of like a cascade of other resolutions that were passed throughout different, throughout the Northwest Indiana. Next slide, please. But surprisingly, where this all came from, which is Highland, we were sort of lagging behind in terms of getting our own town council to pass their resolution. Our council is a conservative majority council. And so it took us a little bit more of a targeted effort to just get their attention. So we had a campaign just to put more pressure on them, just to even have a conversation about this opportunity. And so this is just showing that we finally got an opportunity to speak during a study session. I think it was 20 minutes. We actually ended up, they allowed us to speak for 40 minutes, I think up to an hour, because there was an interest there. Ultimately, they passed their own resolution. Next slide, please. And as part of that, they had to send a letter of commitment. This was through all of the government entities had to send a letter of commitment to NERC saying, yes, we want to be part of this resilience cohort application, this regional application. Next slide, please. And so this is just a bit of a timeline. I won't go through all this. We kind of already talked about this already. But I would say, I would want to highlight for the proof of support. So at the time that we submitted the application, we had over 1,000 signatures. So that was something that we could show to NERC, to all these governments. And then we also fundraised over $15,000 to also show support. Next slide, please. And so these are all the governmental entities that were participating in the program, that were part of the resilience cohort. Some of these kind of joined in at the last second. But yeah, we had the 3 counties participate. Majority of these cities and towns were in Lake County, because that's just the most populated part of the region. And so we were accepted into the program in January. IU awarded us 2 interns. They typically award 1 intern, so that was a surprise for us. But we also had the understanding that just because we had a regional application, the first regional application through this program, that we're going to need a lot more interns. And so we saw that as an opportunity to also recruit interns from IU and elsewhere that were hopefully representative of the region, our diverse region. And so we actually recruited 4 interns. They actually all happened to be from Northwest Indiana or had ties to Northwest Indiana. And then that fundraising that we did, we actually dedicated those dollars to provide a stipend for those interns that was somewhat comparable to the stipend that the 2 IU interns were provided. And so in May, they started that greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Next slide, please. And so the greenhouse gas emissions inventory is close to completion. They released an executive summary of that. They're just doing some data checks. And all the communities that participate in that inventory also opted to participate in the following year, which is this year, which is to create a climate action plan. So we made some history for the state of Indiana, which is we created the first regional climate action plan in the state of Indiana. And it's actually one of the few in the country, because there's not that many regional efforts on climate change. So that was a really great thing that we were able to do in terms of just making some history there. Next slide, please. And so right now, NERC, now that we're in the climate action planning phase, this is just recent, I think this past month, where they made a call for a climate action planning task force. Next slide, please. And so this is just a screenshot of that call for participating in that task force. And this past May. Next slide. And these are some of the things they're asking for. So a diversity of perspectives, a diversity of expertise. They want a climate action plan for the region that's representative of our diverse region. That comes from folks that are technical experts and just folks that are everyday residents that have different experiences and backgrounds. And so they want something that people have ownership over and that feels like it's representative of the region. Next slide, please. And so these are the next steps. So right now we're in the process of creating the regional climate action plan, and where the hope, I think the goal is that local governments will be informed by this regional climate action plan to expedite and accelerate their own plans, and which leads to implementation. So there will be some cohesiveness there for sure between the region and all the governmental entities that exist within Northwest Indiana. but it's also allows for hopefully a simpler way, now that there's this framework, for local towns, small and large, to use that framework to make their plans even more quickly, and then to implement those plans into action. Next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to talk quickly about my work here in the Office of Sustainability. So as I mentioned before, I started in January. Next slide. And so good thing is we have a climate action plan. So we started with this, was created in 2019. So the main goal here is to become carbon neutral by 2050. How many folks are familiar with the carbon neutral by 2050 climate action plan? Okay, so we have a couple show of hands here. It's good to know. Yeah, we definitely want folks to know about it, and so that means we have a lot more work to do. Next slide, please. So these are some of our current efforts. So I manage primarily the EASY program, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But we're also embedding sustainability in every, we're making efforts to embed it into, programs and policies. So one of them being small business programs, so that's the image to the right. Next slide. We also have a workforce training development program that's throughout the whole city, but one of those is a program just for the clean energy workforce. So that's one of those that we put in there by the Office of Sustainability. Next slide, please. Electrical vehicle charging stations. So we're in the process of implementing those in downtown. Just getting back, another bullet point here is the comprehensive plan. So that's a major policy document that's sort of like what we look at in terms of 30-year outlook of like economic development planning, the use of land and everything like that. So that's another thing that we're sort of embedding sustainability into. And of course, we're also having ongoing community engagement. So just having conversations with residents, with nonprofits, with anyone to work on sustainability issues. And it really takes a community effort. And so to meet that 2050 carbon neutral goal, and my hope is that we get to that goal well before 2050. Hopefully we're a carbon negative city. Next slide, please. And so this is the Energy Assistance Solar Savings Initiative program, which is easy, and that's the program that I manage. And so this is specifically focused on community organizations, nonprofits. And so what this program does is it assists them in completing energy efficiency solar projects. What happens in this program is that we work with partners, and they do an on-site energy assessment. They identify whether they're a good candidate for solar. They identify opportunities for energy efficiency. And so we sit down with them, we provide a report to them and review it with them, and then on top of that, we provide a 50% matching grant up to $10,000 where they can begin to implement some of those actions. And then we also have that opportunity to also connect them to low interest loans if they need additional financing. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The overarching theme, right? So like these questions that I've been attempting to tie in to these two topics is, is there, where is this climate movement happening? Where is there movement to confront the climate crisis? Where is this happening locally? I think the greenhouse gas emissions campaign for Northwest Indiana is an example of that. So yes, there's movement on climate change. And who's part of it? I would say everyone is a part of it. Yes, there's a significant youth population that's part of it. But I think even in the case for what was happening in Northwest Indiana, we had a pretty diverse group of residents that were part of that, young and old, different age groups and different ethnicities and backgrounds. And I would challenge everyone here to also be part of that movement. And I hope that you do. And I think whether you think you're a part of it or not, you're being impacted by climate change. So I hope that you also are part of this movement to take action on climate. Next slide, please. And so you might ask, well, how can I get involved? Next slide, please. And so from a local government perspective, so we're planning to update our climate action plan for the city of South Bend in the next year or two. So that offers an opportunity to give us your voice, your input on how we should adapt and update our climate action plan. And we really want this plan to be known by residents, and that is felt like they own that plan. It's really the framework for creating policies and programs. Of course, contacting your local elected officials is super important. There's also a lot of opportunities through local government where they might ask for feedback on, for example, the comprehensive plan, which is just in process. So there'll likely be some announcements for public input on that. But in addition, there's also press releases or announcements for public input on the renewal of programs or the funding of programs. So that also offers an opportunity to say, hey, I want sustainability elements as part of those programs. Next slide, please. And of course, there's some personal actions that you could take. Yes, and some of these are tied to the last slide too, but having conversations like these are super important, learning more, staying informed, and then using that knowledge to use your voice. Joining or starting a local group. There's a lot of different individual steps you can take, and I could talk about that, during our Q&A conversations, and I could also be happy to provide a talk about that as well. But for sure, like voting is super important too. Bringing in the folks that are going to be advocates for climate change, going to be advocates for climate action, that are willing to put policies and dollars to take action on climate. Next slide, please. So that's the end of my talk. I want to thank you for this opportunity. Stay tuned for future opportunities. Please visit our webpage and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And feel free to contact me at my office number or email. And I look forward to answering any questions, and I hope we can really have a conversation about what are your goals for sustainability, how can we support them, and how we can work together to address climate change. Thank you.